I've been working on this writing project that's gone through quite the evolution over the last 8 years, and since it's returning once again to the outlining phase, for what I hope to be the final time before I take it to an editor, I thought it might do me a lot of good to chronicle its long history so that I can make sense of what I'm doing and where I need to go with it. A lot of writers suggested it might be time to abandon a writing project that's been with you for longer than 8 or 10 years. And although the process of creating the story has been anything but conventional, I've noticed red flags among my manuscript that I've been told to look out for. But I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'm stubborn. I'm very stubborn. I have a deep love for this thing and the perseverance to keep working on it for another 10 years if I really need to. But I need to know that trying to finish this project is still the best way to utilise my time as a writer. So, let's go back to the beginning, with the first draft of a pilot I labelled Squad 6. I've always been deeply fascinated by the Italian wars of the 16th century. Anyone who's familiar with that time will know just how many intriguing stories and characters there were from that period, and how all the unfolding politics of the world tied all those stories together. Most of all, I was fascinated by the story of Spanish conquistador Cortez and his arrival into Mexico City. It was one the Aztecs had built in the middle of then Lake Texcoco and had named Tenochtitlan. Many of the conquistadors wrote about how the city was much like a land of fantasy, and as a writer who had only dabbled in some Catcher-in-the-Rye fanfic at the time, I was itching to try my hand at the genre, and had found the inspiration I needed. I began writing a pilot that, while having its own fictional characters and universe, was profoundly similar to the story of the Spanish conquest of Mexico, right down to the Spanish and Nahuatl names. On the Spanish side, I came up with the idea of a reconnaissance unit, one that specialised in the ecological, cultural and spiritual study of this civilization whom I'd clearly based on the Aztecs, and my protagonist Pinto, the youngest member among the 6-man group, suffering from imposter syndrome. On the Aztec side, we follow Citlali, the short, hot-headed prince who takes drastic and uncalculated action against a reconnaissance unit in the wake of the Spanish arrival. Much like how Firefly started with a feature-length episode, my pilot also clocked in at 90 pages. I thought it was great. I thought there wasn't a bad moment from the first page to the last. In fact, I was so convinced of my success, I submitted my work for a professional review. I thought they'd tell me how brilliant I am, and how this had huge potential to be greenlit for some multi-million-dollar production. Yep, I was that naive. The review, fair in every possible way, was quite the wake-up call. I was endlessly introducing characters who didn't get enough time to develop. I spent too long exploring the world and lore without focusing on the actual story. The dialogue, while strong in a sense, was meandering and confusing. With all the Spanish and Nahuatl names, it was difficult to tell whether this was fantasy or alternative reality, and was recommended that I lean hard either one way or the other. It seemed to me there was a huge disconnect between what was happening in my head and what was coming out on the page. But really, it was just bad writing. Still, my reviewer gave me something to take away from it all. As well as having a lot of faith in my premise, JS took a lot of interest in the religions I had built for these two clashing sides, and suggested I dive deeper into the syncretic themes of the story. I wasn't even familiar with the word at the time, but after a bit of poking around I started to get an idea for it all. Syncretism, the amalgamation or attempted amalgamation of different religions, cultures or schools of thought. This was something I'd always been fascinated by, but until then, I had no idea there was a word or concept for it. So after a bit of research and time to reflect on changes, I went back to the drawing board. I culled some characters, but maintained my focus on both the Spaniards and the Aztecs. I did little to alter Pinto's story and the fate of the reconnaissance unit because, in order to continue into the second episode, those events had to play out in a certain way. The overarching story that would be this first season centred around Pinto and Citlali who, following the sacking of Citlali's homeland and a betrayal in the squad, escape Mesoamerica to find their way back to Spain, or Sabia, as I called it then, encountering other characters based off icons from the Italian Wars. And to this day, much of that concept remains the same, albeit with some changes I'm not yet ready to disclose. Much of Citlali's story I did restructure, beginning with the character's name. I was also really fond of the relationship he had with his mentor character, a Spanish soldier who had been stranded in Mexico by the first fleet of expeditionists. I like how they had found a way to interact with each other despite the language barrier, and how Menti's calm temperament often eclipsed Citlali's short temper, so I gave them more focus in the next draft. When finished, it was 20 pages more than my last, and I started to second guess what I was doing. I reached out to the fella in charge of the analysis service I'd sent my script to, and as if understanding of the headspace I was in, he was kind enough to give me a little lesson in writing, namely, the character arc. At the time, I thought his advice, while well received, was only so helpful. My script, despite its length, was intended as a pilot, and I couldn't have a character go through a transformation that quickly. I was a bit stuck on what to do, so I shelved the project for a while to focus on my videography, and often return to that email to really get my head around the execution of a character arc. I knew from characters like Walter White and Michael Corleone that a character arc made for an excellent story, and at some point I decided either Pinto or Citlali needed one, but it took me a long time to deconstruct what I had done with Squad 6 to make room. I binned the idea of Squad 6 the show and thought to view the story through the lens of a movie franchise, taking a title from a Nahuatl word I thought sounded really nice. Omenti, 2, a recurring number throughout the script. As painful as it was, I scrapped the reconnaissance unit, but kept Pinto as the primary character. Only I changed his name to Pol, and instead of the aloof young soldier suffering from imposter syndrome, Pol was a sardonic soldier with a criminal history who had deserted his post in a time of need, and was now on the run from both his countrymen and the Aztecs. Citlali became Isel, the Aztec prince who, despite lifelong torment from his kin, felt a need to await the arrival of his silver-skinned god Zalok, foreordained to begin an age of enlightenment. I also gave more focus to Rebanias, the acting expeditionist leader and analogue of Cortez. I was interested in the many journals Cortez had made while on his campaign through Mesoamerica, and tried to recreate that feeling of reading them in Rebanias' scenes, through the use of the character's VO. But there lay another problem. Finding a balance between three main characters. I'd seen multiple protagonist stories executed well in movies like 21 Grams and Amores Perros, and after a bit of research, I found Aussie screenwriter Linda Aronson's book 21st Century Screenplay. In it, she details techniques the writer can use to juggle multiple main characters in a screenplay, one being through the use of an inciting incident that directly involves all main characters, another an overarching story, or macro plot that all the characters have stakes in. With everything I felt I needed in place, I got to work on Omenti where and when I could, and a year later I had the piece finished. It clocked in at just under 120 pages, had character arcs for all three of my main characters, and among the events that unfolded during the conquest, it explored the similarities between a Spanish and Aztec god. I thought it was pretty good, and after a few drafts I was feeling pretty confident with it. In fact, there are scenes in there I would have loved to keep in my current work in progress, but unfortunately, they just don't fit in its current state. With renewed hope, I submitted Omenti for a professional review, only this time, I was worried the report might come back with a lot of criticism, and so I braced myself for such. As I expected, my review wasn't so favourable. Annoyingly, much of what was criticised in Squad 6 remained in Omenti. Too many characters, rushed scenes, unfocused story, meandering dialogue, all elements I thought I had addressed. But again, my reviewer was fascinated by the premise and saw a lot of potential in whatever I was trying to produce. It was back to the drawing board once more, only this time, a little comment that had appeared in the review was growing on my mind. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Not sure what's happening next time on Ink and Jordy. I'm currently tossing up between a random book review or a video on titles, but either way, stay tuned.